This is World Business Report. I'm Manuela Saragossa. Greece will default on its debt. That's the conclusion of a majority of leading economists in Europe polled by the BBC World Service.
I think Greece will default because what they need to do in order to avoid a default is simply too painful for them to achieve.
So what does the Greek finance minister think of that?
Well, I beg to differ, as you can imagine. The real question is, can a country like Greece service its debt? And the answer to that question is yes.
We ask what it all means for the euro, plus we'll have the latest from the financial markets, and we're inviting your views. You can get in touch by email, world.business@bbc.co.uk, or via Facebook at facebook.com/BBC Business. That's all coming up. What do you do when you're up to your ears in debt but with no means of paying up? Well, usually you have two options. Either you get friends and family to help you out, or you default. In other words, you don't pay up, grit your teeth and suffer the consequences. The governments in both Ireland and Greece have reached out to their Eurozone family members for a financial lifeline. Both are desperate to avoid default because that would make any further future borrowing astronomically expensive. But many believe a default is inevitable. If so, then the deep sacrifices being made by the Greek population may all be in vain. We went to Athens to sample just how much Greek government spending cuts are affecting people there and whether they think the government should default on its loans.
I had the wage cut. It's been rather difficult because I see a lot of my friends being unemployed, and I'm trying to support them, and not just financially, but trying to support them in making a choice, or many of them are talking about going abroad, or you know what, you're going to hear a lot of people blaming the government and blaming the state. It's a very easy solution to blame someone else, but I think that we all have our share of blame.
We shouldn't hurt anyone, and especially not our lenders. We must return the money, and I even believe that at the end of the day this will benefit the country and the young people, as they must understand the need to develop their strength and endurance for difficult times. Greece isn't a country of leisure and indolence, but a country of creativity that has many natural assets, the sun, tourism, its islands and production force, so they can easily find the money to repay its debt.
At
this point in time, yes, I believe it should. The correct political decision is that the country defaults or even severs itself from the European Union for a certain time. But at this time, the people, the majority, doesn't lean towards this direction, so such a move might be worse. So I don't really know what should be done with the loan. They've extended the repayment period, and that is certainly not good for Greeks, as the more the loan is prolonged, the overall debt gets bigger.
The view from the streets in Athens. Well, we've done a survey of 52 of the most influential economists in Europe. These are the people that provide official forecasts to the European Central Bank. And it's bad news for Greece. The majority of the 38 who responded said they believed Greece will probably default on its debt anyway, despite all that financial and economic pain. Two of the economists who participated in that BBC survey were Gabriel Stein, director of Lombard Street Research here in London, and Didier Duret, Chief Investment Officer at ABN AMRO Private Banking. Earlier on Monday, they came into Bush House, into the studio here, and I started by asking Gabriel Stein, did he believe Greece would default?
Yes, I think Greece will default because what they need to do in order to avoid a default in terms of cutting their budget deficit is simply too painful for them to achieve, and default, therefore, is the easier option, even though it's not an easy option, of course.
And Didier Duret, you have a different view, I take.
I think it depends very much on what we call a default. Restructuring is not a full default, meaning that if we can reorganize the debt over the years, it will certainly help Greece to come through the big pain of having a huge service of the debt, meaning the interest that they have to pay for the debt.
I think when people hear the word default, they panic and they think it necessarily means something disastrous. Is it disastrous if Greece defaults?
It has a lot of consequence for the country who is defaulting about its future capacity to go into the market and then to borrow.
Short term, Perhaps. But I think we should be clear that history shows that if the only threat the people who have lent you money have is to say, if you default, we won't lend you any more money, then it pays to default. And countries have defaulted throughout history, and their creditors come back and lend their money again and again.
But there is a price to pay, which is in terms of the cost that you have to bear if you borrow money, meaning if you default, the people will lend you money at a higher cost, meaning that the interest that you have to pay for the debt will be higher and will also be a burden in the short term.
There is a larger moral question to this economic question here as well. Why is it that we expect the Greek people to take all the pain of cuts in spending to meet the terms of the repayments that they have with the EU and IMF bailout, rather than, say, to have a default now, a restructuring now, and let the banks, the people who lent Greece in the first place, take the pain?
One of the arguments is that if we default, we create a bigger problem than in Greece. We create also a bigger problem for European banks that have exposure to these Greek banks, for instance. And it creates what we call a systemic effect, meaning that it's a ripple effect that will also be contagious to other countries.
Let's say one thing. You imply in your question that somehow the borrower is guiltless and the lender is guilty. I disagree with that.
But it's not quite saying the borrower is guiltless. It's saying that the people who are paying for the borrower's price, should they be taking?
But they are
that
the
pain?
ones who have benefited from the borrowing. I'm not saying that I favour defaults, but I do think that they will happen. Simply to repeat, in order not to default, countries like Greece, like Portugal, and also, let's be clear, like Spain and Ireland, the only way to avoid a default is if they can bring their budgets into balance and start paying down debt and so on. And to do that, they have to meet certain growth targets and certain budget balance targets. And meeting the targets is extremely painful. And the reason it is extremely painful is because they've been living above their means. And there comes a situation where they will say, do we prefer to take all the pain in a default now rather than to depress our economy year in, year out for the foreseeable future?
Let me throw this question then at both of you. If Greece does default, would that necessarily mean the end of the euro as we know it?
Not necessarily. History very clearly shows that you can have a monetary union between a very large country and a very small one. That's not a problem. But you can't have monetary unions between equals without eventually becoming fiscal unions, political unions. However, if you have a fiscal union, it means that you take on the responsibility for each other's debts. And I cannot see how the German voter and taxpayer would be prepared to take on the responsibility for Greek debt, let alone Italian debt. Therefore, to my mind, even though it's possible to have a default without countries leaving the euro, the long-term future of the euro is either a complete breakup or getting rid of some countries which, let us be clear, in the view of Germany, never should have been in the euro in the first place.
Can you see that happening?
I see the euro staying and stitching all together with a kind of a probation period, and this crisis is probably limited in time. Let's not forget that all the Latin American countries were able to get through an even harsher debt crisis than what we are living. Simply we are not used to that.
Didier Duré, their Chief Investment Officer at ABN AMRO Private Banking, and also Gabriel Stein, Director of Lombard Street Research here in London. Well, Greece's Finance Minister is George Papakonstantinou. A short while ago I asked him what he made of economists' expectations that his country would inevitably default on its loans.
Well, I beg to differ, as you can imagine. Greece is in a program and its funding needs are fully covered this year and part of next year. We're in the middle of a program to have a fiscal consolidation effort which is quite substantial and which has already shown results, and a program of structural reforms which will boost growth potential. So at the end of the day, you're asking if a country will default. I mean, that question, the real question is, can a country like Greece, service its debt? And the answer to that question is yes, if you have primary surpluses and if you're growing at a healthy rate. In terms of primary surpluses, we reduced the primary deficit from 10 percent of GDP to 3%. We're going to bring it to level this year, and we will be running a primary surplus from 2012 and going up to 5%.
But in the meantime, the Greek people are having to take an enormous amount of austerity. And isn't there a risk that you're sucking the life right out of an already very fragile economy there in Greece?
Well, if you look at the EU as a whole, you will see that where Greece is now is where the European Union was a couple of years back, where recession went to -4 for the EU in its entirety. So we're not in a situation that no one has found themselves before. It is true that people are being hit at the moment. It is true that there's businesses which are closing and employment is going up. This is the unfortunate price to pay to be able to reduce what was clearly an unsustainable deficit and bring our finances in order. But compared with other countries, I would dare to say that there is a recognition in this country by the majority of the population that this is a necessary process. It's a painful one, but it's a necessary one, because we had gotten to a point where we were spending much more than we were earning in terms of receipts, where the economy was getting completely uncompetitive, and we now have to make this right. And it's a difficult process, but it's the only process that exists.
Okay, well, you must be very aware of what's going on in the rest of the European Union with Portugal on the brink, and also Ireland now, the new government, they're trying to tinker with the bailout terms. What message would you send to your colleagues in Portugal and Ireland?
I do not like sending messages to other governments that are having a very hard time to
but you must have an inkling of what they should be doing.
Well, the situation in Ireland is different from one in Greece. The problem there is the banks. The situation in Portugal, again, is different. It's a decade of low growth, but their debt and deficit figures are nowhere near as bad as in our case. So each country has to choose its own path. It is a difficult path, but I would be very, very careful to offer advice. In our case, what we have done is to decide to bite the bullet and do what we had not done in many, many years, which is to take decisions that we've been delaying for many years, to convince for the time being the population that this is something that we have to go through, and we have to go through it all together.
And that was George Papakonstantinou, the Greek finance minister. Well, as we heard, he said that the Greek budget, he reckons, will be running a primary surplus by 2013. So is that a realistic forecast? Well, I asked the BBC's economics correspondent, Andrew Walker.
I think it's quite likely that with a determined implementation of a very tough policy, they could achieve a primary surplus in the government's accounts, but it's important to remember exactly what that means. It is the balance in the government's accounts before you've accounted for interest payments. So given the size of the Greek government debt, once you've added in those interest payments, it's safe to assume it'll be in deficit to a substantial extent for some time to come.
You've been looking at the results of the survey overall as well, this BBC survey, and I thought it was interesting that despite the majority of respondents thinking that Greece would default, a majority of economists also think that the euro will remain a single currency in its existing form. Is that surprising at all?
Not really, and one reason I'm not surprised is because the European leaders themselves clearly do envisage the possibility of countries defaulting at some stage in the future. The bailout system that they have devised for the long term, which replaces the current temporary system from 2013, does seem to me to envisage precisely that. I've got the template for it, if you like, that the leaders agreed at the summit last week, and it does talk about in circumstances where a member state's public debt can't be put on a sustainable path, that they should engage with active negotiations with creditors to ensure their direct involvement in restoring debt sustainability. A lot of words, but what I think that means in practice is that they do envisage at least a partial default in some circumstances. And when you look at the circumstances today, Greece would be the obvious first candidate that situation might apply to.
The BBC's economics correspondent Andrew Walker there. You're listening to World Business Report on the BBC World Service with me, Manuela Zaragoza. Now, we asked you, the listener, whether you think a Greek default is a good idea, and it certainly prompted a lot of comments on our Facebook page. Steve Pollard wrote, "The speculators should be forced to pay for their bad bets and not the people of Greece. Greece has a chance to show the world the way in this and teach these banksters, as he calls them, a lesson once and for all." Whereas Roger Rosman commented, "I watched as the population in Greece rioted over the austerity measures proposed to fix their economy. They don't get them. They don't get it. Let them experience default." Well, you can post more comments there. The address is facebook.com/BBC Business. Let's